Hello, webinar entitled Transitioning to a Resource Efficient Economy with Keith Freegard, brought to you by the BPF and the Plastics Consultancy Network. For today's webinar, your host is Keith Freegard, as you can see on the screen. Today's webinar gives an overview and answers the most pressing questions regarding packaging and sustainability and how to transition into a resource efficient economy. Before I hand over to Keith, just a quick reminder that you can pose your questions to us by submitting them into the questions box on your GoToWebinar control panel. So without further ado, over to you, Keith.
Good morning, everybody. I thought I'd start with my video on so that we can at least attempt to look like normality and you can see me, so hello. But in order to give you a bit more space to look at the slides, we'll just turn the video off. This is a photograph of me in those old days when we used to wear a suit and a tie to work. For those people who don't know me, I have a background as a chemical engineer. I've had all my career has been spent either in large-scale manufacturing or the last 20 years in different companies involved with making environmental and renewable products. I held a position as the Vice Chairman of the British Plastics Federation for several years. Had a couple of years advising URIC, the European Recycling Industry Confederation, on their plastics recycling policy, and I was a few years, I think 6 years, a non-executive director at the On-Pack recycling label. And my biggest role recently was 16 years starting up and then growing a company called Action Polymers, which I sold my shares for a few years ago and is now still doing strong. So today's talk, I decided to keep it relatively simple. We'll talk a bit about the shape of the economy, then the metrics used, partnerships in a resource economy, how important people are, and what the benefits are that arise from moving towards a more resource efficient transition of a circular economic model, and then we'll have some questions at the end. So let's talk about shape. Here is the traditional diagram, which is of a linear business. Oh, hang on a minute, I've just clicked the button that said leave webinar. Let's say no. I know what I need to do. That's better. A linear materials economy, been around for a long time. Most of my manufacturing career in the early days, this is what we did. We got raw materials from the cheapest available source that did what we wanted them to do. We made products and we sold them to consumers. That was the area of concern. Actually, we weren't really that bothered about what happened to the stuff at the end of life. It probably went to waste, but that was beyond the point where we'd made any money out of the transaction. When you look at this diagram, the words that really struck me on it are oh, sorry, that's better. This word here, the assumption that resources are infinite and you can just take them and keep on taking them out of the ground, which I think was the way when the Industrial Revolution was growing. But actually, we've all realized we can't continue to do that. And then at the other end of this linear model, the assumption that the Earth has this kind of infinite regenerative capacity to deal with whatever we throw back at it. And that may have worked when you lived in a kind of economy where you took things off the land and you killed animals to eat and you took things out of the trees and you just threw that all back into some hole or chucked it in a river, then the Earth probably can cope with that. But as soon as you start making synthetic materials and converting things into really durable products and materials, then that really doesn't work. And then as an engineer, the first thing you think is, well, how do we measure this? You know, what's the efficiency of this system for converting resources into products and delivering benefits to consumers? And I think in a linear economy, it's basically an input-output model. You know, how many tons did we take in, and what did we sell out at the other end that was useful selling stuff? You know, if I used 100 tons of plastic and I sold products that weighed 90 tons, then I'd have a 90% material efficiency measure across the part of the economy I was interested in. But then I thought, is it actually right just to measure each individual silo? In the production make bit, you're worried about your raw materials in and what goes out. But if you extend that boundary to the point where the stuff comes out of the earth and then all the way through to the end of consumption, for some materials, I don't know, take maybe aluminium, for example, my understanding is you need to mine thousands of tons of material out of the ground to deliver 1 ton of aluminium. And the resources involved in doing that are absolutely huge. So let's move on to the circular economy, which is supposed to be much more efficient for the use of resources. And on this relatively simple diagram, which I quite like the colors and I quite like the theory, I've added the idea that there's some input. And the original drawer of the diagram is thought about people designing resource efficient products, making them, distributing them, consuming and using them. And it sort of assumes in this model that everything that gets assumed is collected, and then they've sort of added on in the recycling phase a little bit, oh, we'd better allow for some residual waste coming out of the system. Now actually, probably even in relatively advanced circular economic models going on in the current day, scrap is lost at production still. There are losses in distribution, things get broken and lost and damaged and stolen. Certainly consumers and users of products are not making sure that every single product used ends up into a controlled collection system, so things get binned and lost and littered and broken. And even in collection systems now, there's sorting to be done, so things get wrongly rejected and you lose something there and then you lose other stuff. So there's actually multiple outputs, even in some of the best examples of a more circular economic model. And if you think about measuring this, it's a bit more difficult. You haven't just got one in and out. I was thinking if maybe you added up which of these outputs are useful, because one person's production scrap might be somebody else's in-feed raw material, and rejected materials that are rejected because there's the raw material at the sorting phase probably get picked up and used by a different material recycler. You'd have to have a lot more knowledge. It'd be quite difficult to measure, but you might be able to say that those useful materials that do finally become a new product are the useful outputs. But of course, the other concept of this circle is it's not just a single use anymore. How many times do the molecules in the material that I'm focused upon go around the system? Is it 2, 3, 4, 10, 20? Quite hard to measure, particularly because if the molecules, all the metallic atoms are exactly the same, how would you pick a product up and count the number of cycles that each molecule has done? So it's quite difficult to measure. I sort of think the average recycled content is a relatively good measure of how efficiently this is working. If you look at something like the UK milk bottle sector for HDPE blow molded bottles, then you could begin to get a measure from all the main blow molders as to what level of recycled HDPE they were using. And that kind of long run figure should give you some idea of what percentage of the molecules are going round and round multiple times. My guesstimate is it's in the 25 to 35% range for HDPE bottles. And I know that if you try and make an HDPE milk bottle with more than 40 or 45% recycled content, it starts to get tricky because of changes in the molecular structure. But even, if you find perhaps the very best example of this might be a deposit return system operating in Norway, which I think recently claimed 97% of bottles placed on the market being captured and collected. And that's probably getting close to perfect. So there we are. The future could be circular, but I think there are always leaks. So this zero future waste is still a long way off. And in terms of where we are now, I think probably many products, there's an attempt to capture and recycle them. Some go back into a closed loop application, some end up in open loop other products, and eventually become waste. And then if you have one more thing about shape, I quite like this example, because they've started to say, instead of a circle, let's try and draw that sort of infinity loop shape that's used to represent an infinite continuation. And I quite like the way this is done. And this example is for the agricultural sector, which we'll talk more about later on. So metrics. As you can see, I'm quite interested in how you measure things. When I think back to my early days in manufacturing and production with making bottles of domestos bleach or meat pies or things like that, most of the time, if you knew the mass you were dealing with, how long you were dealing with it, and whether it made any money, that delivers most of the metrics that you need to run your business. How many tons did you sell last week? What was the throughput in tons per hour on average over the last month? How much did it cost us to buy raw material to make those tons? All the numbers are basically combinations of these three core things. And that becomes what we report on. In the last accounting period, we had sales of X and made profit of Y, and we consumed so many 100 tons of material. But roll on to the current day, and the word sustainability is being used by everybody in industry and manufacturing and government. Trying to nail down what it means is really difficult. And it's pretty good, in my view, that the United Nations took it upon themselves, 186 countries, I think, in the United Nations, to come up with this set of sustainable development goals. And if your business is thinking about starting to implement some sort of set of new metrics, then I'd say this is a really good starting place. And here in this example, which I got from the annual sustainability report for a company called Indorama Ventures, really big global PET manufacturer, they've then sat down and had a real good think about which ones of these goals are most applicable to our business. And here they've ranked them with a sort of 3-star: major impact, moderate impact, minor impact. Not surprisingly, goal number 12, responsible consumption and production, scores of 3. And then they've got partnering is important, and collaborating with other organizations, and health and safety. So once you've been through the exercise, you can start to pick out the things that are important to your business and your market. But it's not just carbon here. In my view, every individual business operating in every market will probably have a slightly different set of priorities that feel correct for them. And the way that business is branded, the existing strategy of the organization, and the sort of culture that exists within the people and the way the business runs will kind of impact on what feels like the right choice. And you're pretty much free to pick what feels right for you. I think as this becomes more established, we will see common sectors and markets and product types develop a set of common metrics which are right for the businesses in that sector. Because then, of course, you would have a common set of metrics in which to look at the competitive benchmarking with other people in your market. And you should really all be using the same scoring system to enable that to be done. It's also this process of deciding which goals are right for your business is a really, really great opportunity to start getting all your staff and your personnel involved, make them feel valued. You know, what do you think is important in the way we run our business, and what metrics should we be using? It's starting to become a mandatory thing. I had a look at the situation. I think in the UK, since even April 2013, people quoted on the stock market have to produce an annual sustainability report. And then I found this little link here for this quick summary of where in different parts of the world sustainability reporting is mandatory. It's far from mandatory everywhere, but I think it's becoming the thing that people want. I think staff want to see it being done, and certainly investors are becoming really aware that individual investors and institutional investors really want to know what their pound notes are going to support in terms of all the different things. This one at the bottom is really useful. If you want to get going down the role of using the Sustainable Development Goals to develop a set of metrics for you, then I'd visit that website. I've pulled out some that I thought would be applicable to your classic sort of plastics converter and recycler type business. Carbon is up there at the top, you know, some sort of measure of the carbon impact of what you do, your operations, your impacts on the environment, direct carbon release. You know, if you're an incineration of waste business, that would be a pretty major thing. But the other gases that get released as well, you know, if you're an anaerobic digestion company, then I should think methane's pretty important. If you're processing polymers, what's the impact of the volatiles that go off into the environment? And then, of course, all businesses in plastics are using raw materials. It's one of their biggest costs and one of their biggest impacts. Understanding where it comes from and the carbon impact that it carries with it, that embedded carbon from the downstream supply chain when it was first taken out of the ground, is what really has a massive impact. And we know from past studies that quite often recycled polymers are maybe only 25 or less than 20% of the equivalent virgin polymer impact. Then I think you probably have to look at your end products. You know, am I selling products that are designed to enter and work effectively in the circular economy? If I did some score of eco-design or design for recyclability, how many of the existing products I sell would score well? Could I use that as a basis to compare myself with my competitors? To what degree as a business am I engaged with the end-of-life collection system? Am I actively engaged in encouraging my customers and consumers to return their product at end of life, get it back to me, put it in the right collection system? Or am I simply paying the minimum cost to someone who does that job for me, what I call checkbook responsibility? Then there's water use, effluent disposal, the obvious energy consumption, knowing where your energy came from, land use, property, how much of my products am I losing, spillage control, a direct impact on the environment, all your logistics, your travel. And then you get down to those more, probably not moved away from the classic manufacturing measures, but you know, what's the way I deal with people? Am I fairly treating people? Is there evidence that we're an equal employer, that we've got diversity? Do we get our people involved in the way we run our business? Are my supply chains ethical? There's a really long list here, so I'll stop now on that. Here's an example. I found this one. Renewy, a big European waste management company, and they've taken the trouble early on in their quite long sustainability report to put the headline sort of dashboard up of what's important to them. They've picked up on their overall recycling rate. They're collecting waste and recycling it, and they've got their recycling and recovery rate. It's quite an important number. In this waste handling sector, accidents have been important, so they think that's important. They run a lot of vehicles, so how many of their trucks are on the Euro standard? How many complaints they get? And they've got a measure down here. How many of the senior managers are women? Because they obviously see that as an issue within the waste sector. And then they put this CO2 number up here. I looked at this a bit. Carbon avoidance intensity ratio for FY20. It doesn't actually hit me right on the nail, does it, in terms of what that means? And I looked it up. It's the carbon equivalent emissions of every 1 million tons of waste they handle. So I think that means that if they handled exactly 1 million tons of waste, there would have been 233,000 CO2 equivalent tons released. I think my message to Renewy is that one could be a bit clearer. So what are the business challenges from moving to these new metrics if you do it? Does that suddenly mean you've done the job? Tick. Or does it mean you're just starting off on a big journey? First of all, I think mostly people still are not familiar with what these numbers mean. What is a kilogram of CO2 equivalent. What does it look like? How big is it? You know, when we've been using currency and mass and time, we all know that. But we don't know what these new metrics are. They're hard to understand sometimes, and they don't really lack meaning or scale. Is 233 kilograms of CO2 good or bad, or is it poor? Is it best in class? We don't really know until they're used. And do the systems to monitor and record the numbers that we said are important actually exist? I might know how much electrical power my extrusion machine uses, but do I know where that power came from and what its carbon impact is? My raw materials might come from a fairly complicated supply chain, and knowing the total impact of the supply chain that delivered those materials to my door might be really difficult to get your handle on. Then, if you're not familiar with the numbers and if it's not a mandatory system, how do you benchmark your sustainability performance against your competitors? Until you've got a long run understanding of what good, bad, average and best in class is, how do you know whether you're doing well or not? Also, I think sometimes organizations do what I call sticking it in the office of the man down the corridor. I've seen this done with quality in the past when the early days of ISO 9001, the job of preparing the manual and running the audits and getting the certificate every year was given to the guy who lived down the end of the quality department, and he had a load of manuals on his shelf. Spent ages working on it, but it didn't massively impact on the way the other people in the business carried on what they did. It was only when that got converted to a complete quality management system approach that I felt it actually came out of that quality office and started to impact the whole business. I think there's a real danger with this sustainability metrics that it could be given to a small group of people in the organization to do that job, and then it doesn't really disseminate itself through the whole business and really change the way people work. Then there's what I've called the laggards, the lemmings, the traditionalists, the negative ones. The chap down the moulding shop who's been there 25 years and there's nothing you can tell old Joe about how to do injection moulding. If you go and tell him he's got to change to understanding the carbon impact of each injection moulding machine and understand how sustainable the materials are used in the moulds that he's buying, he's probably going to be a bit negative. I think this is only really going to work when this becomes mandatory across all sectors and the system kind of shakes down a bit more. Partnerships then. I've used this slide before, but it still does the job for me. Here's a classic little loop between consumers and a recycler. And on the one side, you've got the people who are often left to collect the waste from the consumer and the primary sorting plant sorting out the cardboard from the metal, from the plastics, etc. The plastics recycler receiving the polymer. And then on the making side, you've got virgin polymer producers, parts welders and branded OEMs. Now, as we move forward and start making a transition to a much more circular economic approach, then what we will see are much more partnerships going on between people on this side of the waste collection circle and these people on the traditional making and manufacturing side. So we will see lots more examples of useful business collaborations and joint ventures happening all along this cycle. And quite often those collaborations and joint ventures are really beneficial because the people involved are actually traditionally competitors, but they all mutually stand to benefit from doing the job well. So if a branded OEM can make products which are much more suitable for recycling and they were in a commercial relationship with a waste management company, then you could have a much more meaningful discussion between the two about, well, if you design more of your products so that they yield more material or they're easier to collect, then this whole system works better. So I think lots more integrated supply chain partnerships which spread away from the old silo mentality to one of people working together to look after molecules of polymers as they move around the circle. I think the area which has not really fully been tapped into yet is the massive opportunity this gives to enable a much longer relationship with the consumer, because if you move away from just selling in something and then getting on with selling another, and you want to look about how you're going to capture the products at the end of life, you can start to have a basis for a discussion with your consumer. You can help them to make the decision about when they need to renew or change or buy another product, and really help them to deal with the disposal decision. So if you sold someone a washing machine and you take the old one away, that seemed to be part of the beneficial service. And I think that approach can apply to many more products than it does today. I call this idea molecular stewardship. I'm not sure I've heard many people using that phrase yet, but you never know. In the future, they might start believing that if you treat every molecule that comes into your business as something that needs to be cared for and looked after, don't do anything to the molecules that's going to make them difficult for the other people in the chain to deal with, then maybe that's a shift in thinking. Here's a few examples of joint ventures and collaborations. Suez, Linden Bazell, Unilever, Ionica, Indorama. One that I've seen just recently here, look, BASF, Quantafuel, Remondis signing a collaborative deal to focus on chemical recycling development just recently. Some of these have been around some time. Here are Coca-Cola, we all know them, Plastipack, biggest UK producer of PET preformed bottles, Cleantech Recycling. Big partnership to get 50% recycled content. Lots of examples of that happening. People. Without people, we've got nothing at all. All these organizations are basically groups of people working together. And when you think about the impact of shifting to a completely different way of thinking about your materials and the way you deal with your economic interaction with your materials, then I think it really starts to change everyone. The business owners, the senior managers, the team leaders, the operators, the workers. If you really put in a massive set of new metrics that control and influence the way they run their daily lives at work, then people have to change. You know, even if that means remembering to switch the heaters off on the extruder when you go home at night. Stuff like that becomes really important. If you've just used mass, pounds and time for 30 years, there's quite a lot of unlearning the way you used to do things and relearning new skills and methods to deal with the new metrics that have been thrown at you. People's traditional comfort zones that they sit in are really going to be challenged. I've seen this recently. I was working with a financial section in a company who were implementing some new metrics, and they just hated changing. They wanted me to just give them all the answers. They couldn't conceive that I couldn't explain exactly what the level of recycled content would be in 3 years' time. They didn't like it at all. They were really challenged by it. People's workloads and skill sets are going to change quite a bit as well across different business functions, some more than others. You know, the financial people might just need to add a few boxes to their reporting system and start recording the CO2 equivalents, for example, but others might have massive change. There will be skills gaps in your business which you cannot just retrain, and you might have to bring in significant new blood and new people to actually bring about the level of change that's required. And I think really most fairly sophisticated organizations of any scale need to recognize that if they want to become a sustainable business, it's not just something you can bolt onto everybody's existing job. You need a big change management person or team to be with the authority and the freedom to run right across the business, making sure it changes in a coordinated way. And then individual success criteria will change. Not how many tons did I sell last month? Did I sell tons of product that are going to return to us and reduce our environmental impact? Might become different. Some people will love this change or be exciting, many will not. And it will take a long time, 5 to 10 years probably. So let's start talking about the benefits. I'm going to use as an example, as I finish my talk, a company called Talma Group, who I've worked with for the last 2 years, and they approached me and said, Keith, could you help us become a more sustainable business with our plastics business? They're an agricultural plastics company operating in the UK, Europe and worldwide, making products that involve animal forage and crop baling and cotton harvesting. In Europe, the main markets are hay, silage production for animal feed, and bales of straw used for bedding, etc. Their main products: baling twine, PP string for making square bales, net wrap nets of HDPE that go around those cylinders you see in the fields, and stretch wrap for wrapping those up. They're a market leader in a greater than 50,000 tonne of plastics European market, plus exports on top. This gives you an idea of the sort of thing they do. These bales in a field in lovely England somewhere are wrapped in H2P net wrap. And from their website, you can see that the whole ethos of their business is caring for farmers and helping them do a better job on the farm. We are farmers, we know what you do. We'll give you products that make your life better and easier and more efficient. And they've also recently started to say, and also we will look after, help you, the farmer, to deal with the waste when you finish with using our plastics on your farm. And this explains them taking part in a UK scheme for collection of plastics from the environment. And they also have done a big job about making the early stage commitment to sustainability. So they're on the journey. This Affinity loop they like, and they've done this internally and is now available on their website. They're starting to make the long-term commitments, the strategic statements that we're going to change the way we do business. So what are the benefits? First of all, if you say we're working out in the environment anyway, our consumers live in the outside environment on farms and we care about that, then saying you're going to take much more care of your materials and the resources and the way you run your production business fits really closely with that. They already have products which have relatively short life, 12 to 18 months use in the field to do what they need to do, pretty much single polymer types, so they're pretty good for recycling. So that fits. Already collection schemes are in place, some mandatory in European countries, others voluntary. And Talma have been up there at the forefront, on the front foot, saying we're going to take part in the collection schemes. So that harvesting of the end of life PP twine and HB net wrap has started, and they tend to come through as segregated streams. They're already involved in taking part in the schemes, paying money in to help with the cost of collection and gathering together the diverse spread out products in the farms across Europe. So they're already in a position to access that collected material and think about buying back their own molecules. They're invested in R&D, and that starts to prove the capability to get their own collected plastics back into their products. And they're beginning collaborations with recycling firms to invest in brand new technology which can deal with their more difficult products. And it puts them in a place where they can start to really prime the pump of this circle. So they're doing that molecular stewardship and forming the partnerships and the collaborations I talked about earlier. So then what they've done is, when it works, not working yet, it's going to take a few years, they actually create a supply of raw materials which they own themselves, and they know where their materials came from. What better molecules to get back in your business than the ones you bought 2 years ago and you made into a product and you've got them back? And then one of the big benefits, which I keep banging the drum about, is if you can get this to work, you've got a large slice of your supply of raw material that should be completely isolated from the hideous volatility we see in the virgin polymer marketplace. And if 30 or 40% of your products are coming in with a relatively fixed cost, when you blend that in with your volatile virgin product, you put your own hedging in place. You're smoothing out volatility. There are challenges. So from my last slide, just to sort of look at some of the things that are difficult. Matching the rate at which that collection system starts to pull through the products that you want from all across Europe, making that grow at the same rate as you want to incorporate recycled content and sell them across Europe. It's really difficult to make that work in a sort of harmonious way. Developing products, proving that they work, testing them in a field, in a seasonal market, which takes a year to do, it's really, really difficult to get that to work. They're on with that. You've got to relearn how to market and sell recycled products. If you say our products are best, you've still got to convince people your products are best when they have high recycled content. Your farmers have to accept that if you're going to start selling products with recycled content, what will that mean in price? Are they just going to expect you to have much cheaper products, or will they be the same price? How long it takes to go from starting this journey to get to a point where you've got massive economy of scale. You know, I think that really a plastics recycling plant needs to be producing more than 10,000 tons of output to start getting to a scale that makes economic sense. Some would say 20,000 tons. The lack of knowledge within the business. You know, they don't have people who've traditionally known about life cycle analysis and carbon footprint, so there's probably going to need to be some training or new blood coming in there. Some zones of the business will get much more impact than others. If you switch from buying 30 or 40,000 tons of polymer from 2 or 3 big virgin polymer companies to accessing collected plastics from a diverse range of small recycling businesses spread all across Europe, the job of managing purchasing and managing that supply chain is much, much harder in my view, and likely to need a different set of skills from someone who spent 20 years dealing with virgin polymer companies. You could damage your brand. If this all goes wrong and the recycled products don't work, you run a risk of damaging your brand. And there's still a big job to do to convince internal doubters who think it's still not the right thing to do. And you have to get everyone on board. I'll stop now. I've carried on over the area. I'm at a point where I don't have a great deal more to say other than this is a long journey. It involves a massive amount of energy and a big, big change to your business. Thank you. Questions next.
Excellent presentation there, Keith. A very good and insightful one there, which will be made available to all of you guys in the coming days as well. We have had a few questions come in. The first of which is HDPE net wrap damaged by UV? This would be an issue for multiple recycling trips.
I like a good technical question. Yes, the plastics which are out in the environment, HDPE net wrap and also polypropylene twine can get damaged by long-term exposure to UV. Talma know a lot about this. They do add UV protection additives to the virgin plastics they make. And then they've been looking recently at the levels of residual UV additive in products that come back from the field. And you get, you know, quite a lot of differences. Not surprisingly, Northern Europe different to Southern Europe. Bales of square bales are made into great big stacks. So actually, it's only the bales on the outside of the stack that are exposed to the UV for long term. Very often, the HDPE net wrap is then encased in an outer skin of stretch wrap on the outside. So, long story short, yes, it can be an issue. 2, it can be measured. 3, it's possible if you use high levels of recycled content to kind of top up the used UV additive within the new product. But again, it's a new thing, it has to be managed, you have to measure it, you have to learn a bit more than just buying the magic dust and putting it in the virgin.
Great stuff. This is your last chance to all that are listening in to send your questions in to us. regarding this webinar. Another question that we have is, how do you transition towards a circular product economy in markets where it's much more diverse?
Yeah, I see the point. I mean, I quite sensibly used an example where the products go to quite known markets, i.e. farms all around you, and there's a system in place to capture stuff back from farms. You know, for some more complicated products, if you say, I don't know, supplying a component that's buried down inside a 2-ton motor vehicle somewhere, and that was what you put on the market, it might be a real challenge to access those components when the cars eventually reach their end of life, which could be a long way away, 10, 15, 20 years. So I accept it's more difficult, but it does involve that you have to tap into what technology exists. So maybe you do have to go to the big car scrap companies and say, what are you doing with the plastics? Are you separating out the plastic, which is the same type as the plastic I put in the car 10 years ago? Could I buy some of that same type plastic and look at whether it's going to be good enough for putting into your products? So I think it's more difficult, but I think it can be done.
Great. And then the last question that I've got here is, how do you make money in the early days as a new company? And how does a company deal with not making much money in the first few years?
Yeah, that's a really strong question as well, because as I explained, I think most recycling operations take quite a time to reach maturity. You know, in Europe, we've got some sectors, I know PET bottle recycling been going on for 20, 25, 30 years. So we know how to do that. We know how to build plants at 10, 20, 30, 40,000 tons capacity, efficient collection systems. Those businesses are in there and can be run in a way that competes with the top pricing and the throughputs that you get from the virgin polymer sectors. But if unfortunately you're in a sector where there is not yet a great deal of development of the new required technology, I don't know, textiles from clothing might be an example, then you've got to take a massive great suck of breath in and say, well, if we're really going to get to a sustainable business, we can't immediately go out and tap into a working set of plants that happen to be recycling exactly what our product is. And then you've got not much choice but to say, well, we're really going to have to invest here for a few years, support the development of the technology, perhaps invest in some higher risk recycling ideas where we're not quite sure whether the process is going to work. And then if we do get it working, find out if the products can be put back into our business, and then maybe give it a few 4 years before it starts to reach an economy of scale, which I suggested was about 10,000 tons. So unfortunately, I think there are some specialist sectors where this is a long-term investment and might only lend itself to those companies with scale and a depth of pocket, but a level of understanding about the need to do this, that are prepared to make those really big commitments. It's difficult. It might take a long time. It might cost a lot of money and a lot of effort. But many companies are reaching the conclusion, and so certainly their staff are, we've got to do business differently. And unless we change, the world ain't going to change. That's the bottom line.
Very wise words. And sorry if you can hear that outside. I've got a lawnmower going off. Sadly, we have run out of time, but questions can still be forwarded to us at events@bpf.co.uk, and we'll pass them on to Keith as we get them in. Before I sign off, just a quick reminder that yes, you will be getting this video sent out to you in the next couple of days, or that will probably be next week now, I'd say. Just a quick mention of a few webinars coming up next week, actually. One of which is a PCN related webinar coming up. It's entitled End of Life Challenge for Flexible Packaging, Multi-Layers and Pouches with Dr. Terence Cooper, and that's on Thursday next week at 12 p.m. All details of that and all other webinars can be found on the BPF webinars page. Thanks again, Keith, and to all who have listened in. And we look forward to working with you again, Keith, in future on other seminars and webinars. And yeah, thanks again, and see you guys soon. Take care.
Goodbye to anyone who's not yet left the meeting. Thank you.
Cheers.